Liang Yue had never thought much about how death would feel. Not the suddenness of it, not the quiet emptiness of the room, and certainly not the crushing weight of regret that pressed down on her chest like a stone. At 53, she thought she had learned to endure life's disappointments with a polite resignation, but lying on the hospital bed, so quiet, so achingly still, she realized how much of her life had been lived in the shadows. Her mind flashed to Liam. Always Liam. Always the man she had married because of duty, propriety, and the faint hope that love might bloom in time. The irony was cruel. She had loved him fiercely, with a depth and persistence that had never wavered, yet he had loved someone else all along. Her younger sister, Elena. How she had believed she could fit into the role assigned to her, how she had tried to be the perfect wife, the patient, smiling shadow behind a man whose heart was elsewhere. And the years had stretched endlessly, like a gray highway, lonely and unyielding. Now, as her heart finally stopped its futile fight, a strange sensation overtook her. It was not pain, not darkness, but a sensation that was harder to define. Like being unmoored, lifted out of time, and flung backward. She blinked against an invisible brightness, and the sterile hospital scent was gone, replaced by the warm, dusty smell of early spring, the scent of ink and paper, and the faint tang of polished wood. And then she saw it. The office of the local civil affairs bureau. Her hand trembled involuntarily, hovering above a pen that felt both familiar and alien. She was young again. 23, the soft lines of her face replaced by the fullness of youth. The bright excitement that had once filled her chest on this very day, her wedding day, was back, but this time it was tinged with foreknowledge. She remembered every humiliation, every sting of neglect, every lonely night in a cold bed while Liam's thoughts wandered to Elena. Every moment of a life wasted in longing for someone who never truly wanted her. Liam's impatient tapping on the desk drew her attention. He had changed very little. His uniform crisp, the stiff pride of a man convinced of his own charm, the subtle arrogance of a soldier who believed obedience was love. His eyes flicked to her, then down at the blank line on the marriage form. "You sign it," he said, the tone carrying both command and expectation. There was no warmth in his voice, no pause for consent, just the assumption that she would submit willingly, as she always had. But she did not feel the old panic rising, nor the anxious flutter of a heart desperate to please. She felt something she had never truly known before: clarity. She remembered the scribble of her past self's signature, the way she had written her own name with trembling hands, the faint smile of duty mingled with fear. She remembered the nights of silent tears, the whispered apologies to herself, the endless compromise. And in that memory, a quiet resolve was born. Her hand lifted, pen hovering above the paper, and she hesitated only a heartbeat before moving deliberately. She wrote slowly, carefully, savoring each letter. Elena. Time seemed to still itself as she pressed the pen down, the ink glistening under the overhead light. The act felt sacrilegious and yet liberating, like setting fire to chains she hadn't realized she had worn. Liam's eyes widened just enough for her to notice, but there was no reaction of anger, no snarl of confusion. Perhaps he assumed she was being indecisive, or perhaps he never truly looked closely at her at all. She handed over the form with the calmness of someone who had spent decades learning patience, yet had finally decided she no longer needed it. The clerk, a middle-aged man with a quiet efficiency, glanced at the name and nodded, stamping the certificate with a familiar, authoritative click. Liang Yue's fingers curled around the paper, but the weight of it felt different now. Light, almost ethereal. It was as though she were holding a key to another life, one that belonged entirely to her. She stepped outside into the soft sunlight, the air warm on her skin, carrying the scent of cherry blossoms just beginning to bloom. The city hummed around her, oblivious to the small but seismic shift she had just set in motion. She walked slowly, savoring the sensation of freedom, of choice, of control over a destiny she had once believed unchangeable. Her heart, which had grown so accustomed to the hollow ache of longing, now felt buoyant, almost weightless. The memories of past encounters with Liam and Elena swirled in her mind. The stolen glances, the whispered conversations, the moments when she had restrained herself from confrontation because she believed it was her duty. She remembered the way Liam had always dismissed her feelings, the way Elena had leaned into his attention without remorse. In the past, each slight had built upon the last until the pain became her companion. But now, seeing the threads of her life laid bare, Liang Yue understood something she had never allowed herself to admit. She had been living for them, not for herself. Her first steps away from the bureau were tentative, then firm, as a new determination settled over her like a cloak. She would not be anyone's consolation prize. She would not play the part of a dutiful wife to a man whose heart was elsewhere. She would not allow the ghost of regret to haunt her twice. Every detail of her new plan was vivid in her mind. The acceptance letter from Sunhaven University, the train ticket she would soon purchase, the small suitcase she had saved for months, filled not with trinkets and dreams of a man, but with the beginnings of a life she would build herself. And yet, even as she moved, part of her heart trembled with a strange, bittersweet emotion. She knew she would never truly forgive herself for the subtle cruelty of her act. Submitting Elena's name in place of her own was a betrayal of societal expectation, a disruption of plans, and yet, in her soul, it felt undeniably right. She thought of Elena, bright and careless, always drawing attention with a kind of effortless charm Liang Yue had never possessed. And she allowed herself a private, quiet smile, imagining her sister's delight at the marriage and the inevitable entanglement of Liam's misplaced affections. It was not vengeance, it was liberation. The street outside the bureau was bustling, yet Liang Yue felt untethered, almost suspended above it all. Children ran past, their laughter ringing sharp and clear, and she noticed the delicate sway of a mother carrying groceries, the wind playing with the ribbons in her hair. The ordinary life around her was now a stage on which she could perform for herself alone, and the thought thrilled her. She had always imagined freedom as something distant, abstract, like a ship on the horizon. Now it was tangible, waiting at her fingertips, waiting for her to grasp it. By the time she returned to the small guest house where she had lodged, her mind was already mapping the next steps. She would retrieve the acceptance letter, pack her belongings, and prepare to leave the city. Every detail mattered: her clothing, the timing of her departure, the avoidance of suspicion. She knew Liam would eventually discover the change, but by then, it would be too late for him to manipulate her. Her life would no longer be a series of reactions to others' desires. It would be an assertion of her own. As she lay down that night in the modest bed, listening to the faint creaks of the wooden floor and the soft rustle of curtains in the spring breeze, Liang Yue felt a serenity she had never known. The freedom she had seized did not come with fanfare or applause. It was quiet, intimate, and wholly her own. She imagined the years ahead not as a continuation of mistakes, but as a canvas on which she could paint herself anew, with colors of ambition, curiosity, and joy that had been denied to her in her previous life. For the first time, she allowed herself to think in terms of possibility rather than regret. The woman she had been. The one who had spent decades yearning for a man who never truly saw her, was no longer in control. This Liang Yue was alert, vigilant, and, above all, resolute. She would carve out a life that belonged to her entirely, and no one's expectation, no one's love, and no one's neglect could alter it. And as sleep finally claimed her, she dreamed not of Liam or Elena, not of what had been or what might have been, but of a future where every choice was her own. She dreamed of classrooms buzzing with discussion, libraries filled with dusty books and new knowledge, evenings working under the soft glow of lamplight, and the quiet triumph of achieving something purely for herself. It was not a dream of revenge, nor of recapturing lost youth, but of discovery. A life lived with intention and heart. And when she awoke, she would step fully into it, leaving behind not only her past but the weight of regret that had threatened to crush her for so long. Liang Yue, at last, felt the intoxicating thrill of her second chance. The door to Liam's family quarters opened with a familiar creak, a sound that in another life would have been the herald of routine and quiet suffering. Liang Yue stepped across the threshold, feeling the weight of memories pressing down on her chest, but this time she carried none of her old desperation. She had returned to a space that was once suffocating, and yet the air felt different. Lighter, almost electric, as though it recognized the change in her. She paused in the entryway, ears straining. Voices rose from the sitting room. Liam's calm, soothing tones, and Elena's high-pitched laughter, the sound of her triumph echoing like a bell in Liang Yue's memory. Her stomach twisted, a subtle echo of the past, but she held herself steady. She could feel the old instinct, to confront, to argue, to plead for recognition, pressing against her, but she pushed it down. She did not need validation. She did not need to be seen. "I swear, if she ever dares to treat you badly, I'll divorce her," Liam was saying, his voice dripping with a kind of feigned devotion that had once crushed her spirit. She remembered the exact inflection, the faint catch in his tone, the hollow charm designed to reassure Elena while ignoring her completely. Liang Yue's lips curved into a faint, knowing smile. In her past life, these words would have ignited fury. She would have stormed in, tears brimming, hands trembling with indignation, ready to assert her presence in the only way she had thought possible. By pleading, demanding, trying to make herself visible in a household that had never truly noticed her. Not today. She stepped lightly into the room, the floorboards creaking just enough to announce her presence. Both Liam and Elena froze. Liam's eyes darted toward her, searching, perhaps for the old submissive expression he had so often seen on her face. Instead, he found calm, quiet, impenetrable, and unsettling. "Elena," Liang Yue said softly, her voice carrying the certainty of someone who had nothing left to prove. "You should get ready for the day." There was no hint of malice, no tremor of suppressed emotion. Just a neutral observation. It was a statement, not a plea. Elena blinked, caught off guard by the lack of reaction she expected. Liam's brow furrowed in unease, though he tried to mask it with a faint cough. That one silent pause, a mere heartbeat, was enough to shift the entire dynamic. The household had been accustomed to Liang Yue's compliance, her nervous attentiveness, her willingness to fade into the background. Now, her indifference was a mirror reflecting the truth they had long ignored. She no longer needed them. Later, Liam suggested buying wedding candy, a small gesture that in the past would have been a reminder of her own constrained role, ending in a lecture or passive rebuke. Liang Yue's mind ticked through the scene with meticulous care. She had memorized every argument, every manipulation, every opportunity to comply or rebel. But this time, she simply shook her head. "No, thank you," she said, the words flat yet polite, a shield against intrusion. Elena's expression tightened as she appeared in the doorway, audacious and radiant, wearing the special linen suit Liang Yue had painstakingly saved for months to purchase for her own wedding photos. In her previous life, this would have sparked a silent rage, a desperate protest. She would have tried to argue, to reclaim what she believed was hers by right. But now, Liang Yue only smiled faintly, a serene, almost regal gesture. "Keep it," she said and stepped aside. There was no bite, no resentment, only a quiet generosity born from detachment. She recognized that the suit was never truly hers. It had always been a symbol of what she lacked in a household that prioritized Elena's happiness over her own. By letting it go, she was reclaiming her autonomy. Retreating to her room, Liang Yue allowed herself a long, deep breath. Here, in the privacy of her sanctuary, she turned her attention to the real prize, the acceptance letter from Sunhaven University. She spread the papers across the small desk, reading and rereading the words that promised liberation, knowledge, and a future of her own making. 10 days, she calculated. 10 days to prepare for departure. 10 days to sever all ties to a life that had never truly belonged to her. Her preparations were precise, almost surgical. She began methodically, sorting her belongings, discarding anything that would tie her to the family, selling trinkets for travel money, and organizing a small suitcase that would hold only the essentials. Each item removed felt like a weight lifted. Each coin earned a step closer to freedom. She experienced a strange mixture of exhilaration and melancholy, knowing she was leaving behind not just people but years of habits, of emotional labor that had drained her spirit. When Liam returned the money he had borrowed for wedding supplies, a sum he had spent on shoes for Elena instead, Liang Yue accepted it without hesitation. His words were sharp, tinged with accusation. "You're so calculative, you. You always think about money over feelings." But she merely nodded, his criticism sliding off her like water on polished wood. Calculative, yes. But in this case, she decided it was the intelligence of survival, not the pettiness of greed. She had learned, painfully, that detachment and foresight were far more valuable than compliance or blind loyalty. The following days were a careful dance. Liam proposed a joint trip to the photo studio. A seemingly innocent outing, but in her past life, this excursion had ended with her humiliation and invisibility. Liang Yue walked alongside them, detached, observant. Elena clung to Liam, radiating triumph as the photographer captured their couple-like poses. When it was finally her turn, the film ran out. A small, humiliating moment. But this time, she felt nothing. No sting, no desire to plead, no need to demand justice. She simply smiled faintly and left the studio, her mind already focused on the next step of her escape. Days later, Liam handed her a train ticket to the capital, insisting it would allow her to follow them later. But Liang Yue, fully aware of the pattern of deception, recognized the gesture for what it was: hollow, meaningless, a token of control he believed he still held. She accepted the ticket quietly, tucking it away like an artifact, but it no longer had the power to dictate her choices. Her life was no longer a series of reactions to their whims. In those 10 days leading up to her departure, Liang Yue felt a curious mixture of freedom and unease. Every familiar corner of the Chun household reminded her of old wounds, yet each step she took was a reaffirmation of her agency. She spent her time with care, finalizing her travel plans, confirming arrangements for university, and mentally rehearsing the life she intended to claim. She allowed herself to imagine mornings filled with the scent of ink and books, evenings lit by lamplight and quiet study, and nights of deep, unbroken sleep without the pangs of longing for a man who could never return her heart. By the 9th day, Liang Yue had become almost unrecognizable to those around her. Liam and Elena continued their performances, oblivious to the profound shift that had occurred. Liang Yue moved through the household with measured steps, polite but distant smiles, and eyes that seemed to look beyond the walls and into a horizon of her own making. Every interaction, every word, every gesture was deliberate, a shield against intrusion and a declaration of independence. On the morning of her departure, Liang Yue stood at the threshold of her room, suitcase in hand. The room smelled faintly of spring air and dusted sunlight, the same room where she had once cried silently at night, wishing for love and validation. Now, she felt none of that old ache. Instead, there was anticipation, a thrilling sense of embarking on a path entirely of her own design. She allowed herself a small, private smile. "Goodbye, Chen household," she whispered softly, not with bitterness, but with a quiet finality. "And thank you for teaching me exactly what I will never be again." She stepped out, leaving behind not just a room, a family, or a set of expectations, but a lifetime of regret. Each stride toward the train station was a rhythm of liberation, a beat marking her passage from the life she had endured to the life she would claim. The city stretched around her, familiar yet unclaimed, waiting for her to etch herself into it. For the first time, Liang Yue understood the exquisite power of choice, the weight of her own destiny resting entirely in her hands. That evening, as she boarded the train to Sunhaven, the humid coastal air mingling with the promise of freedom, Liang Yue felt a sense of serenity she had never known. Every smell, every sound, every motion of the train seemed imbued with possibility. Her past life, with its shadows and regrets, lay behind her, and ahead lay a life not dictated by love unreciprocated, familial expectation, or social convention. Ahead lay knowledge, growth, and a chance to exist fully for herself. And for the first time, Liang Yue allowed herself to truly imagine happiness. Not as a borrowed feeling or a compromise, but as something entirely her own. Liang Yue awoke to the soft glow of sunlight spilling across the wooden floorboards of her room. She stretched, a slow, deliberate motion, aware of the tension that still lingered in her shoulders. Freedom, she realized, was not instantaneous, it was cultivated. It required vigilance, patience, and meticulous planning. Her acceptance letter to Sunhaven University rested on the small desk beside her, a beacon of a life she was determined to claim. For the first time in decades, her mornings were hers alone. Her plan for unraveling ties had to be methodical. She began with the simplest steps, items that held memories of a past life she no longer needed. Trinkets from her childhood, hand-carved fans, embroidered handkerchiefs, old photographs, were carefully wrapped and sold at the local pawnshop. She watched the money exchange hands with calm detachment. Each coin felt heavier with the weight of possibility, lighter with the shedding of attachment. She had learned, painfully, that sentiment could be an anchor keeping her from moving forward. When Liam returned money he had borrowed for wedding supplies, it was a ritual Liang Yue had memorized from the past. She accepted it without hesitation, her face composed, voice neutral. Liam frowned, misreading her silence for calculation, and remarked sharply, "You always think of yourself first, you. So calculative." Liang Yue allowed herself a tiny smile, invisible to him, for she knew exactly what this meant. In her previous life, his words would have cut her, left her apologizing for existing. Now, they were mere sound waves bouncing off walls she had long since built. Calculative, yes. But this was no longer a flaw, it was a shield. She began to observe Liam and Elena with a careful, quiet scrutiny. His attention to her sister had always been excessive, bordering on indulgent. Elena thrived on it, basking in the subtle favor that Liang Yue had once craved. In her past life, each instance of this attention had felt like a personal betrayal. Now it was merely evidence, data she could use to navigate the household with precision. She could predict Liam's moods, Elena's movements, even the likely outcomes of their interactions. This clarity was intoxicating. The next step was psychological. She needed to cement her distance without arousing suspicion. When Liam suggested a joint trip to the photo studio, a seemingly trivial outing, she agreed, though every step she took was calculated. Elena clung to Liam like a shadow, radiant and confident, while Liang Yue remained detached, her posture relaxed, her expression unreadable. She watched as the photographer captured Elena and Liam in poses meant for couples, each frame a subtle assertion of their bond. When her turn came, the film ran out. In another life, this would have been a humiliation she could not bear. Now, she simply smiled politely, handed over her unused props, and stepped aside, letting the moment pass without internal turbulence. The more Liang Yue observed, the more she understood the intricate web she had been trapped in. Liam's gestures were performative, designed to maintain appearances rather than genuine connection. Elena's attentions were self-serving, a performance perfected through years of indulgence. And Liang Yue, who had spent decades trying to fit into this carefully constructed stage, realized she had no role to play anymore. Her rebellion was not dramatic or loud. It was quiet, strategic, and irrevocable. Each day brought small victories. She sold the last of her keepsakes for additional travel funds, packed her suitcase with precision, and mapped out her route to Sunhaven. Every preparation reinforced her autonomy. She no longer feared the isolation she had once dreaded. In fact, she welcomed it. Each step away from the Chun household was a step toward a life that belonged solely to her. Yet, life has a way of testing resolve, and Liang Yue's patience was soon challenged. Liam announced, casually, that he planned to take Elena to the capital first, promising that he would send for her later. In her past life, this had been a promise she clung to desperately, a tether that kept her waiting, hopeful, and ultimately trapped for years. Now, she recognized the hollowness instantly. She nodded, acquiescing outwardly, but inwardly, she smiled. She had no intention of waiting. His promises no longer held power over her. Her departure required precision. She timed her movements, scheduled her errands, and ensured that her interactions with Liam and Elena were functional, neutral, and devoid of emotional leakage. There was a quiet satisfaction in this discipline. Each measured word, each calm refusal, was a reaffirmation of control. She could be polite without being vulnerable, cooperative without being subservient. She was no longer a shadow. She was a strategist, crafting her own path. The day of the studio outing arrived, bright and bustling with the city's usual chaos. Liam and Elena arrived first, as always, the dynamic between them a familiar choreography. Elena's smile was radiant, almost triumphant, as she took her place next to Liam. Liang Yue followed, maintaining a calm exterior. She observed the poses, the way Liam adjusted Elena's hair, the subtle gestures that communicated dominance and favoritism. She did not flinch, did not seek validation. She was outside the performance, a silent witness to their theatrics. When it was finally her turn to be photographed, the film ran out midway. In another life, she would have felt the sting of inadequacy, the humiliation of being ignored. Now, she simply smiled faintly and stepped aside. The photographer gave her a polite nod, unaware of the subtle drama playing out behind him. Liang Yue's detachment was not emptiness, it was clarity. She had learned to see the truth of people's actions without being ensnared by them. Days later, Liam handed her the train ticket to the capital, insisting that it would allow her to join them later. Liang Yue examined it carefully, noting the logistical impossibility of the plan. She accepted it without comment, tucking it into her suitcase like a relic of a life she no longer intended to live. The gesture, meant to assert control, was powerless against her resolve. She had already mapped her escape, calculated every step, and embraced the life waiting for her in Sunhaven. Evenings were spent in meticulous preparation. Liang Yue practiced the art of detachment, rehearsing interactions with Liam and Elena in her mind, refining her posture, tone, and expressions. Each day reinforced her autonomy, her capacity to navigate the household without emotional compromise. She was no longer reacting out of fear or longing, she was acting with intent. By the 10th day, everything was ready. Her suitcase was packed, her funds secured, and her route mapped. Liang Yue moved through the Chun household with calm precision, maintaining a polite distance from Liam and Elena while quietly observing every detail. She had learned their patterns, anticipated their responses, and ensured that her departure would be seamless. That night, as she lay in bed, she reflected on the transformation she had undergone. The young woman who had once feared rejection, who had clung desperately to a love that was never hers, had become someone entirely different. She was strategic, observant, and self-assured. Her past life, with its regrets and longing, had taught her the value of autonomy and the importance of choice. She had seized her second chance, and she would not squander it. The Chun household slept, oblivious to the quiet revolution unfolding within its walls. Liang Yue closed her eyes, feeling a serene exhilaration. She was about to leave behind not just a home, but decades of entanglement, manipulation, and unmet expectations. Ahead lay a city brimming with opportunity, knowledge, and independence. For the first time, Liang Yue felt the true weight and joy of freedom. Her mind wandered to the life that awaited her in Sunhaven, lecture halls filled with ideas and debates, libraries thick with books and possibilities, evenings spent studying under lamplight, and nights of self-determined work. She imagined herself walking through the city streets, unencumbered by expectation or manipulation, fully immersed in a life chosen by her alone. Sleep came gently that night, not with dreams of longing or regret, but with visions of a life reclaimed. Liang Yue knew that when she awoke, She would be stepping fully into her own story, leaving behind not just the Chen household, but the weight of decades of regret and unfulfilled desire. And with that, she felt, for the first time, the exhilarating certainty of a life that belonged entirely to her. The morning air carried a faint edge of spring warmth, but the streets of the city still held a chill that made Liang Yue tighten the collar of her coat. Today was another day of calculated motions. A trip to the photo studio, a routine outing that had become a quiet test of patience and strategy. She walked alongside Liam and Elena, her posture calm, measured, and intentionally neutral. Liam's hand brushed against Elena's as they moved, subtle but deliberate. Liang Yu's stomach tightened, not with longing, but with the familiar ache of having been always on the outside. In another life, she would have bristled, demanded recognition, or silently seethed. Now, she simply observed, her thoughts sharp and clear. She had nothing to prove and no patience for drama. The streets were bustling. Vendors called out their wares. The smell of fried bread and roasted tea mingled in the air, and children darted between pedestrians, laughing and shouting. Liang Yue noticed everything. The details of the city, the textures and sounds she had never appreciated before, too distracted by longing and resentment. Her senses, sharpened by years of observation and now freed from emotional captivity, made the world vivid and alive in a way it had never been in her previous life. They were crossing a wide intersection when it happened. A car swerved suddenly, tires squealing against the asphalt. Time stretched, each fraction of a second becoming monumental. Liang Yue froze, her instincts kicking in, but too slowly. She had always relied on Liam's presence to intervene, and now she realized how deeply that expectation had been ingrained. Liam reacted first. His body moved with the precision of a trained soldier. He lunged toward Elena, pulling her to safety, his arms strong and decisive. Liang Yue, caught off guard and off balance, had no such protection. The car clipped her side, and she was thrown against the cold pavement. Pain flared sharply, radiating from her leg and shoulder, a white-hot reminder of her mortality. Elena screamed, the sound sharp and frantic, and Liam's attention shifted entirely to her. "Are you okay? Are you hurt?" he cried, brushing at her hair as though she were fragile porcelain. Liang Yu's vision blurred, not from the hit, but from the stark, bitter clarity of the scene, the pattern of her old life replayed in a single, brutal moment. She was the one sacrificed, Elena, the favored sister, shielded and comforted. And yet, unlike before, there was no instinctive plea for recognition, no desire to be rescued. The ambulance came swiftly, and Liang Yue was lifted onto a stretcher. The white hospital walls, the antiseptic smell, the muted beeping of monitors. All familiar, yet now different. Pain throbbed through her body, but her mind was lucid, focused. She could feel every sensation with acute awareness, each heartbeat a reminder that she was alive and, more importantly, still in control. Liam hovered at her bedside, his uniform slightly disheveled, eyes wide with anxiety. But not for her. Only for Elena. His hands shook as he tried to apologize, stumble over explanations of instinct and reflex, yet he never once touched Liang Yue with care. The sight stirred something deep within her. Not anger, not despair, but final clarity. She had been expendable, and the truth was undeniable. Later, Mrs.
Chen arrived.
The woman who had raised them both, who had always favored Elena with an almost blind adoration, now stood before Liang Yue. She looked at her with a sharp, calculating gaze of someone used to managing family dynamics, yet there was a spark of curiosity, even joy, in her eyes as Liang Yue leaned forward slightly. "I have something to tell you," Liang Yue said softly, her voice steady despite the pain coursing through her body. "I submitted Elena's name on the marriage application." "The marriage? It's hers, not mine." Mrs. Chen blinked, processing the revelation. Her usual composure faltered for just a moment, and then she smiled, the warmth and relief unmistakable. You did the right thing," she murmured. "I will keep your secret for now." No one else can know. Liang Yue allowed herself a faint nod, the act carrying a weight far beyond words. She had finally claimed agency over her life in a way that could not be undone. This was not about revenge or spite. It was about survival, dignity, and finally, the right to make her own choices. The hospital stay was uncomfortable, but not unbearable. Liang Yu's body healed with time, but her mind was already moving ahead, planning, calculating. She used her moments of rest to review her travel plans, confirm arrangements at Sunhaven, and mentally rehearse her departure. Every decision reinforced the boundary she had drawn between herself and a life that had never belonged to her. When Liam visited again, his apologies had evolved into pleading. He spoke of instincts, of dreams, of confusion, but never of genuine care. Liang Yu listened, her expression calm, unflinching. His words, meant to manipulate, fell on a mind that had grown impermeable to expectation, guilt, or obligation. She did not raise her voice, did not cry, did not plead for recognition. Instead, she spoke simply and firmly. Live with your choices, Liam. I am done being part of them. The clarity was liberating. Liang Yu felt no bitterness, no need for vindication. She had finally understood that life's fairness was irrelevant. Only her own choices mattered. She would step forward, unencumbered by the past, and build a future defined entirely by her intentions. Mrs. Chun remained a quiet ally, understanding that Liang Yu's departure was not an abandonment of duty, but an assertion of self. The woman's smile, when she handed Liang Yu a small package of provisions for travel, carried a silent acknowledgement. Liang Yu had done what she needed to do, and no one could question it. By the time Liang Yu left the hospital, the city had shifted around her, though the streets and buildings were unchanged. To her, however, they were different. Each corner, each alley, each bustling market street now felt like part of a world she had earned the right to inhabit. She was no longer merely reacting, she was choosing, moving forward with intention. That evening, she prepared her belongings, ensuring that every piece of luggage, every document, and every small necessity for her journey south was accounted for. Pain and fatigue were present, but they were minor irritants compared to the exhilaration that pulsed through her. Liang Yu allowed herself a rare smile. For the first time, she was the architect of her destiny. As she stepped onto the train bound for Sunhaven, the coastal city's humid air brushing against her skin, Liang Yu felt the exhilaration of movement and the certainty of freedom. The city stretched away behind her, a fading tableau of a life she had endured and survived. Ahead lay possibility, challenge, and a life shaped by her own choices. The train hummed steadily beneath her, a soothing, rhythmic vibration that seemed to echo her heartbeat. Liang Yu leaned against the window, watching the landscape blur past. Fields, rivers, small villages. And felt the tension of years fall away. The sun dipped low, casting a golden glow across the horizon, and she allowed herself to imagine the life waiting for her. Lecture halls filled with ideas and debates, libraries lined with books she could explore at will, evenings spent studying under lamplight, and nights of solitude filled with self-directed effort rather than longing for another's attention. By the time the city lights of Sunhaven twinkled into view, Liang Yu felt a quiet elation. She had survived the final push of her old life, faced down the ultimate test of her resilience, and emerged intact. Her body bore the memory of the hit, the pain and ache of survival, but her spirit had never been stronger. She was ready for what awaited her. Knowledge, independence, and a life entirely of her own design. As the train slowed to a stop and she gathered her suitcase, Liang Yu allowed herself one final thought of the past. Liam, Elena, Mrs. Chen, the household that had both nurtured and suffocated her. All of it belonged to another life. She would carry the lessons learned, but not the weight. From this moment forward, every choice, every triumph, every failure would be hers alone. And as she stepped off the train into the humid, salty air of Sunhaven, Liang Yu felt the first true brush of freedom, the intoxicating promise of a life that was finally hers to live. The train's rhythmic clatter beneath her feet was a lullaby and a drumbeat all at once. Liang Yue pressed her forehead to the cool glass of the carriage window, watching the landscape shift from familiar city streets to winding rivers and distant hills. Every passing mile was a separation from the life she had known, and a reclamation of the one she had been denied. She clutched the small envelope in her hand, addressed to Liam. Inside, she had written clearly and succinctly, sealing the letter with the calm finality she had cultivated over the past weeks. She declared the end of their relationship, enclosed the marriage certificate and the train ticket he had so casually offered, and signed it with a quiet authority she had never known in her previous life. The act felt simultaneously terrifying and liberating, like stepping off a cliff into open sky, but knowing she could fly. Sunhaven greeted her with humid, salty air and the constant hum of a coastal city coming alive in the early evening. The scent of the ocean mingled with fried street food and the faint sweetness of blooming flowers. The city felt alive and untamed, a stark contrast to the controlled and stifling world of the Chan household. Liang Yue inhaled deeply, feeling the first real taste of freedom slide into her lungs. She spent her first day navigating the unfamiliar streets, carrying her modest suitcase through crowded markets, narrow alleys, and streets lined with buildings that smelled faintly of old wood and salt. Every sensation, the tang of seafood in the air, the warmth of the sun hitting her skin, the chatter of passers-by, felt vivid and intoxicating. She realized how much of her life had been muted, dulled by routine, longing, and suppression. Here, everything was sharp, immediate, and alive. Her first stop was her new lodging, a small, modest room near the university. The furniture was sparse, a simple bed, a wooden desk, and a chair that creaked under her weight. She unpacked methodically, placing her books carefully on the shelves and setting up a small space where she could study, write, and plan. There were no family expectations, no comparisons to a favored sister, no looming figure of a husband who did not love her. There was only Liang Yue, and that was more than enough. University life began immediately. Liang Yue immersed herself in classes, each lecture a revelation. The professors spoke with energy and passion, and she absorbed their words with a hunger she had never allowed herself before. Mathematics, her long-standing love, became an escape and a grounding force, a discipline in which effort translated directly into mastery rather than social reward or familial approval. The equations and proofs were not just intellectual challenges. They were tangible reminders that she could create results through her own diligence and skill. Evenings were harder. Liang Yue found work at a small restaurant, washing dishes, serving tables, and learning to navigate the rhythms of labor in a city that was not her own. The work was exhausting, leaving her muscles aching and her hands raw, but she found a strange satisfaction in it. The fatigue was hers alone, earned by her own choices, and it grounded her in the reality of her independence. She could survive on her own. She could thrive. And she could do it without apology or compromise. Despite the exhaustion, Liang Yue thrived in the small pockets of joy she allowed herself. She discovered quiet cafes where the barista greeted her with a warm smile, street corners where musicians played for tips, and libraries where the scent of paper and ink filled her senses. These were her sanctuaries, spaces where she could exist fully as herself, unencumbered by expectation. But freedom came with its own challenges. Within a few weeks, her peace was disrupted. Liam, relentless and unwilling to accept the severance of their bond, tracked her down to Sunhaven. He appeared at the university gates one bright afternoon, his expression a mixture of fury and confusion, the crisp military posture now infused with personal frustration. "You. Why did you do this? Why did you give me to Elena?" he demanded, his voice sharp, unyielding. There was desperation hidden beneath the edge, a lack of understanding that left him unprepared for Liang Yue's response. Her voice was calm, low, and deliberate. "I have no interest in sharing a husband heart. Leave my life undisturbed, Liam." He stared, as though the concept were foreign, impossible to process. His brow furrowed, lips tightening, and for a moment, Liang Yue felt a flicker of something familiar. The old ache, the longing for recognition, for acknowledgement. But she let it pass, swallowed by a wave of resolve. This was not her concern. This was not her life. The weeks following Liam's appearance were tense, but Liang Yu's focus remained unshakable. Classes, study, and work formed the backbone of her new existence. She began to build a small network of acquaintances, fellow students who respected her intellect and diligence, unaware of the drama that had once defined her life. She discovered the joy of being evaluated on merit alone, of being recognized for effort and skill rather than familial position or societal expectation. Evenings became a sacred ritual. After long shifts at the restaurant, she would return to her small room, wash the day from her hands, and sit under the soft glow of her desk lamp, reading or solving mathematical problems. Each solved equation, each note carefully transcribed, became a celebration of self-sufficiency and competence. Liang Yue reveled in the quiet victories of independence, small steps that collectively built a foundation stronger than any she had known in her previous life. Occasionally, she allowed herself to think of Liam and Elena, not with longing or bitterness, but as distant echoes of a life she had chosen to leave behind. The Chun household, with all its drama, expectation, and manipulation, was a closed chapter. She had survived, and in surviving, she had reclaimed something far greater than love or approval: autonomy, dignity, and the exhilarating knowledge that her future was entirely hers. As spring deepened and the coastal city warmed, Liang Yue began to feel the subtle thrill of possibilities stretching before her. Friendships, academic growth, and self-discovery blossomed in tandem, a living proof that she could thrive without tethering herself to the expectations of others. For the first time, she allowed herself to imagine a future filled not with compromise, but with the satisfaction of her own choices, the power of her own agency, and the joy of finally being the protagonist of her own story. One evening, as Liang Yue returned from a long shift at the restaurant, she paused on the university steps, watching the sunset paint the horizon in shades of orange and rose. The salty breeze carried a hint of the sea, the distant laughter of students, and the faint rhythm of waves crashing against the harbor. She inhaled deeply, feeling the tangible weight of independence settle over her shoulders like a mantle of quiet pride. The city was not just a place she had arrived in. It was a life she had earned. Liang Yue realized then that the escape to Sunhaven was more than a flight from Liam and Elena. It was a rebirth. Each day she built her life with intention. Each night she rested with purpose. The hardships were hers to bear, but they were also hers to master. And in that mastery, she discovered a freedom more profound than she had ever imagined. She smiled softly, a rare, genuine curve of lips untouched by obligation or resentment. For the first time, Liang Yue was living entirely for herself, and the weight of the past felt impossibly light. The second chance she had seized was no longer just an opportunity. It was reality, vibrant and undeniable. And as the night settled over the coastal city, Liang Yue looked forward, not behind. Sunhaven was not merely a destination. It was a promise, a canvas, and a home for the woman she had finally become. Liang Yue's days had settled into a delicate rhythm, a balance of lectures, study, and evening shifts at the restaurant. The hum of Sunhaven, seagulls circling the harbor, the chatter of students in the quad, the occasional clang of dishes in the cafe, had become a comforting soundtrack to her life. For a while, it had seemed that she could leave the weight of her past entirely behind. Then Liam appeared. It started subtly at first. Letters slipped under her door, notes left at the university reception, urgent inquiries from faculty at her dorm. They were polite enough on the surface, but the subtext was sharp, demanding, intrusive. At first, Liang Yue ignored them, her calm detachment shielding her from the irritation she might once have felt. But soon, the messages escalated. Liam was determined to reclaim control over the life he had assumed was his to direct. He went to the principal, appealing with military authority and personal insistence that Liang Yue be expelled from the university. He claimed she had misrepresented her background, insinuated impropriety, and demanded immediate action. Liang Yue, steady and deliberate, confronted the principal with careful clarity, presenting every document and proof she had prepared. The principal listened, his eyes scanning each page, and dismissed Liam's claims with a quiet finality that surprised even her. For the first time, Liang Yue realized that authority could be impartial, that truth could shield her when calculated correctly. But just when she began to feel a fragile sense of victory, Elena entered the fray. It was during a late afternoon class in the university library, a room filled with the soft rustle of paper and murmured discussion. Liang Yue had just settled into her desk, opening a book on advanced algebra, when a commotion at the entrance drew every eye. Elena, theatrical and radiant, entered with a dramatic flourish. Her cheeks were streaked with tears, or the semblance of them, and her gaze locked on Liang Yue as though the library were a stage and the world waited for her performance. "You." Elena's voice trembled, loud enough to carry across the rows. "Please forgive me. I've been cruel. She dropped to her knees, a show of vulnerability perfected over years of attention-seeking. Students gasped, some leaning forward in shock, some glancing awkwardly between their books and the scene. Liang Yue froze, the familiar heat of exposure rising in her chest for only a heartbeat. She could feel the old instincts. The desire to defend herself, to explain, to demand acknowledgement. But she quelled them. This was not her stage. This was not her performance. Elena's dramatics were intended to paint Liang Yue as the cruel one, the unfeeling antagonist who had abandoned a man who loved her. But Liang Yue saw through it immediately. She observed Elena's posture, the calculated tremble of her hands, the way she angled her body toward the students for maximum effect. This was not a plea for reconciliation. It was manipulation. Liang Yue stood slowly, the quiet grace of self-possession radiating from her. Her voice, when it came, was calm, unwavering. "Elena," she said, "I have nothing to forgive. I left a life that was never mine, and I will not engage in theatrics." The room fell silent. Even Elena's carefully rehearsed display faltered under the weight of Liang Yue's composure. Students shifted uncomfortably, the drama evaporating in the presence of undeniable poise. Liang Yue turned and walked away, her movements deliberate, measured, and free of hesitation. Each step was a declaration. Her life was hers alone, and no one else had the power to dictate her worth. It was in the aftermath of these incidents that Daniel appeared. He had been a fixture in the math club, a quiet presence with a sunny disposition and an intellect that matched her own. Liang Yue had noticed him before, but now, as the weight of harassment pressed down, his calm steadiness became a balm. He approached her after the library incident, his expression a mix of concern and gentle humor. "Are you all right?" he asked softly, leaning against a bookshelf. There was no judgment, no probing curiosity, only genuine interest. "You handled that impressively. Most people would have lost their composure." Liang Yue studied him for a moment. Daniel's eyes were bright, attentive, and honest, with none of the hidden calculations she had become accustomed to in her family life. For the first time in years, someone's concern did not carry expectation. "I'm fine," she said quietly. "It's just old patterns. They take effort to ignore." Daniel smiled, a small, warm curve of lips that reached his eyes. "Well, if you ever want someone to study with or just talk to, I'm around." There was no pressure, only a steady presence, and it was enough. Liang Yue felt a flicker of something she had almost forgotten. Trust. Over the following weeks, Daniel became a constant, quiet support in her life. They spent afternoons in the university library, poring over complex problems, discussing proofs and theorems, and occasionally teasing each other lightly over mistakes or clever solutions. Liang Yue found herself laughing. Soft, genuine laughter that had not existed in her previous life, and realized how much she had missed simple, unpressured companionship. Meanwhile, Liam's attempts to disrupt her life continued, but they no longer rattled her. Letters piled up, each addressed with care and then torn to pieces in the privacy of her room. She did not read them, for their content was irrelevant. He could not dictate her thoughts or her actions. She was no longer a passive participant in his life. She was the architect of her own. Elena, too, continued her performance, appearing in lecture halls or cafeterias with staged tearfulness and public displays of apology. Liang Yue observed without engagement, noting the exhaustion on Elena's face after each act of drama, recognizing the hollowness beneath the veneer. Her life was separate now, her priorities clear, her freedom tangible. Amid the chaos, Liang Yue began to feel something new, a cautious optimism. Her friendships in the university grew, small but meaningful. She discovered the thrill of intellectual pursuit without external pressure, the satisfaction of earning recognition through effort rather than compliance. And she realized that, for the first time in her life, she was not living in someone else's shadow. By the end of the semester, Liang Yue had established a small sanctuary in Sunhaven. Her life was a careful balance of work, study, and measured social engagement. She had navigated harassment, manipulation, and emotional traps and had emerged unscathed. More resilient, more self-assured, and more aware of her own value than ever before. As she walked along the harbor one evening, the sun dipping low and painting the water in molten gold, Liang Yue reflected on the transformation she had undergone. The young woman who had once been compliant, invisible, and anxious was gone. In her place stood someone who was deliberate, observant, and capable of facing the world on her own terms. And in the quiet companionship of Daniel, she sensed the possibility of connection built on respect, mutual understanding, and genuine care. Not on obligation, expectation, or manipulation. The thought was new, exhilarating, and deeply comforting. Liang Yue smiled to herself, the reflection of the harbor lights shimmering in her eyes. She had survived the siege, found her allies, and claimed a measure of peace. The next chapter of her life awaited. Not dictated by Liam or Elena, not burdened by the mistakes of the past, but bright, open, and full of promise. For the first time, Liang Yue truly believed that she could define her own happiness, and that belief carried a quiet, unshakable power. The nights in Sunhaven had a softness that contrasted sharply with the stifling confines of her past life. Liang Yue often stayed up late, the room bathed in the mellow glow of a single lamplight, books and papers spread around her like a protective cocoon. The quiet was hers alone, and in it, she found a clarity she had never experienced before. It was during one such evening that the first letter arrived. It slipped under her door with a faint rustle of paper, folded and neatly sealed, marked in Liam's precise, familiar handwriting. Liang Yue paused for a long moment, fingers hovering over the envelope, the temptation to tear it open battling with her well-practiced resolve. She placed it to the side. The letter could wait. Or rather, it could be ignored entirely. Over the next few days, more letters came, piling up into a small stack by her bed. Some were desperate, pleading, others were cold, demanding. Each one bore the same signature, Liam, the man who had once dictated her life without consent. Then came the letter that made her blood run cold. It was brief, almost clinical in tone. Elena was pregnant with his child. The words struck like a hammer, not because of the news itself. Liang Yue had never sought to possess or control Elena's life, but because of the calculated torment embedded in the message. Liam had framed it to draw her into guilt, into obligation, into the web she had worked so hard to escape. Liang Yue sat on the edge of her bed, staring at the page, her fingers trembling slightly. For the first time in weeks, she allowed herself a quiet, private flare of anger. Not at Liam, not at Elena, but at the injustice of how she had been manipulated for decades. Then, as she had rehearsed countless times in her mind, she did not write back. She did not engage. She tore the letter into tiny fragments, watching it scatter across the floor like ashes, and finally exhaled. Her life was not for anyone else to dictate. In the midst of this turbulence, Daniel became a constant, steady presence. Their meetings were unhurried, often at the quiet corner of the library or at a small cafe tucked away from the bustling streets. He was patient, insightful, and remarkably perceptive, never probing her past but always offering a hand when she needed one. One evening, after a long shift at the restaurant, Liang Yue arrived at the cafe to find him waiting. The warm scent of brewed coffee and freshly baked bread filled the space, and Daniel waved her over with an easy smile. She sank into the chair across from him, letting herself relax in a way that had been impossible with Liam lurking in the periphery of her life. "You look exhausted," Daniel said softly, his eyes crinkling at the corners with genuine concern. "Do you want to talk about it?" Liang Yue shook her head, a small, tired smile tugging at her lips. "Not really, but thank you." She felt the tension in her shoulders ease slightly. In Daniel's presence, she did not have to perform. She did not have to guard her words or emotions. There was no calculation, no expectation. Only acceptance. They ordered simple meals, sharing bites and teasing over minor mistakes in table etiquette. The conversation drifted naturally, sometimes about classes, sometimes about trivial observations around the city. Liang Yue laughed, a soft, genuine sound that had been rare in her past life. She realized how much she had missed such moments, unburdened by obligation or fear. Daniel reached across the table, brushing a stray lock of hair behind her ear with an absent-minded tenderness. Liang Yu's heart skipped slightly, not in longing for love, but in the quiet recognition of being seen, truly seen, without expectation. "You're different," he said, almost shyly, but in a good way. Confident, strong, independent. It's inspiring. Liang Yue felt a warmth bloom in her chest. She had spent years living in the shadows, chasing approval that was never hers to claim. Daniel's admiration was neither demanding nor conditional. It was freely given, a reflection of the person she had become rather than the one she had once been. Days turned into weeks, and her connection with Daniel deepened. They studied together, worked on projects, and shared small routines that felt like an anchor in the whirlwind of her new life. For the first time, Liang Yue experienced the comfort of companionship that was reciprocal, honest, and nurturing. She realized that friendship, real, equal friendship, could be more sustaining than any romantic attachment forced by circumstance or duty. Meanwhile, Liam's campaign of harassment continued, though increasingly futile. He sent letters, made inquiries, and even attempted to involve faculty members, but Liang Yue met each intrusion with calm, deliberate measures. Each torn letter, each polite refusal, was a reinforcement of her autonomy. Liam's obsession only highlighted the difference between her old life and her new one. She no longer lived for his approval, nor was she entangled in his manipulations. The contrast between Daniel and Liam could not have been starker. One offered steady, respectful companionship, the other brought chaos and relentless pressure. Liang Yue found herself reflecting on this often, appreciating how rare genuine care and understanding truly were. With Daniel, there was no manipulation, no subtle undermining, no expectation that she sacrifice herself for someone else's convenience. With him, she could breathe, think, and exist fully as herself. One particularly quiet evening, Liang Yue sat at her desk under the warm lamplight, reviewing the day's lecture notes. Daniel was beside her, scribbling equations and explaining a particularly complex problem. She listened intently, occasionally interrupting with questions or insights. The room was filled with the gentle scratch of pencil on paper and the muted murmur of their voices. It was ordinary, peaceful, and yet extraordinary in its normalcy. "You're improving," Daniel said softly, looking up with a small, proud smile. "You're getting better at seeing patterns before I do." Liang Yue smiled faintly, the compliment warm but not intoxicating. "Only because I'm learning from you," she replied, her voice steady. There was no boast, no insecurity, only recognition of mutual respect. In moments like these, Liang Yue felt the profound difference between surviving and truly living. She was no longer reacting to a life forced upon her. She was building a life of her own design. Each day brought small triumphs: understanding a challenging concept, navigating the city, mastering a shift at the restaurant, and cultivating a genuine connection with Daniel. The letters from Liam remained unopened in a drawer, their presence a reminder of the past she had left behind. Liang Yue understood that freedom required vigilance, but it also required the courage to reject manipulation without guilt. Each day she chose herself. She solidified her autonomy and strengthened her foundation for the life she was building. As the lamplight cast long shadows across the room, Liang Yue allowed herself a rare, quiet smile. She was no longer bound by the expectations of family, the whims of a husband who had never loved her, or the manipulations of a sister trained in attention-seeking. She was building a life grounded in intellect, hard work, and genuine connection. And in Daniel, she found the first true companionship she had ever known. A relationship founded on respect, shared interests, and the simple joy of being seen and valued for who she truly was. For the first time in decades, Liang Yue allowed herself to hope. Not for approval, not for validation, but for a future shaped entirely by her choices, and for the possibility that happiness could be gentle, reciprocal, and real. The train ride back to the Chun household was quiet, almost too quiet, as if the rhythmic clatter of the wheels against the tracks carried the weight of her anticipation. Liang Yue sat near the window, her hands folded neatly in her lap, watching the familiar scenery roll past. Towns, fields, and small rivers she once knew as home now felt distant, almost alien, filtered through the lens of her new life. She had changed, and so had the world she had left behind. When she arrived at the Chun residence, the air was thick with tension, the familiar scent of the home now tinged with unease. Liang Yue could feel it immediately. The charged energy of unresolved conflicts, the friction between husband and wife, parent and child, favor and expectation. Her first steps inside revealed a scene she could never have imagined in her previous life. Elena, heavily pregnant and flustered, was standing in the middle of the living room, her voice sharp and accusing. "You promised me support. You promised me security, Liam. And now, look at us. You're still writing to Liang Yue? What kind of husband are you?" Liam, haggard and tense, stood with his arms crossed, his pride wounded, his frustration barely contained. He attempted to justify himself, stammering about responsibility, dreams, and obligations, but Elena's fury cut through every explanation. The roles had reversed. Liam, once the omnipotent presence in the household, was now cornered, defenseless against the very sister he had always indulged. Liang Yue's entrance drew no immediate notice. She remained quiet, her presence measured, observing rather than participating. For decades, she had been the one scrutinized, the one manipulated, the one held accountable for every perceived slight. Now, she could watch in detached clarity as the dynamics she had endured for so long played out in new and illuminating ways. Elena noticed her eventually, pausing mid-argument, a flicker of irritation crossing her face. But Liang Yue did not engage. She did not intervene, did not offer counsel, did not demand attention. She simply watched, absorbing the lessons of reversed roles, the fragile fragility of power and privilege, and the consequences of neglect and entitlement. That night, after the household had settled into a tense, uneasy quiet, Liam visited Liang Yue's room. His entrance was hesitant, his posture uncertain. He closed the door softly behind him, the sound startling in its intimacy and vulnerability. "I need to tell you something," he began, his voice unsteady. "I've been having dreams. Strange fragments. Of another life, maybe. Of us. Of the way I treated you, or neglected you. He paused, swallowing hard. "I don't know how to fix it, but I want another chance." Liang Yue leaned against her desk, her expression calm but unyielding. She listened, not with pity, not with hope, but with measured understanding. She had heard apologies before. She had lived through confessions and promises that had meant nothing. Liam's revelation, though shocking in its vulnerability, did not change her resolve. "You've had your chance, Liam," she said softly but firmly. "You made your choices. I lived through the consequences of those choices once. I won't do it again. Your dreams, your regrets. They are yours to bear. I am done being part of them." Liam's shoulders slumped, a mixture of defeat and disbelief crossing his face. He wanted acknowledgement, perhaps even absolution, but Liang Yue could not, and would not, provide it. She had reclaimed her agency, and it was a power he could not touch. The next morning, she visited Mrs.
Chen one last time.
The woman who had raised them both, who had always favored Elena with quiet affection, now looked at Liang Yue with respect and understanding. Liang Yue handed her a bank card containing her savings. A final repayment for her upbringing, a closing of accounts both literal and symbolic. "This is for you," Liang Yue said quietly, her eyes steady. "For everything. Use it as you see fit." Mrs. Chen accepted the card with a solemn nod, understanding more in that moment than words could convey. She had always been protective, indulgent, and at times biased, but she recognized that Liang Yue's departure was not abandonment. It was fulfillment of self-determination. With that, Liang Yue left the Chen household for good. Each step she took away from the home, from the familiar streets, from the lingering shadows of her past, felt lighter than the last. She was not fleeing, she was claiming her space in the world. She was not running from fear, she was moving toward a future she had earned. The train station was nearly deserted when she arrived. She had no ticket south, not by accident but by design. She had prepared for the uncertainty, for the possibility of forging her path anew. And there, as if guided by fate, Daniel appeared. His smile was warm, his presence comforting. "You don't need a ticket to find a home," he said gently, offering his arm. Liang Yue allowed herself the rare gesture of leaning slightly toward him, feeling the solidity of someone who would not demand, manipulate, or control. That evening, Daniel's home welcomed her with quiet warmth. His grandmother bustled about, offering tea and food, laughter spilling over small domestic tasks. Liang Yue was struck by the difference. Here, she was not a daughter, a sister, a pawn, or a figure to be managed. She was simply herself, allowed to exist fully, quietly, and without expectation. As the night deepened, Liang Yue sat by the window, watching the lights of the coastal city flicker across the water. The reflections danced like shards of possibility, shimmering with promise. For the first time in decades, she did not feel the weight of regret, the pull of obligation, or the sting of unrequited attention. She was free, and for the first time, Liang Yue realized that her life, her choices, her independence, her peace, was hers entirely. She had returned to a house haunted not by ghosts, but by lessons. She had faced the lingering shadows of her past, observed the consequences of others' choices, and walked away unshaken. The Chen household would continue its dramas without her. Liam would grapple with the consequences of neglect and obsession, and Elena would confront the realities of a life built on expectation and entitlement. Liang Yue, however, was no longer a participant. She had claimed her second chance, and she would not squander it. As she closed her eyes that night, listening to the distant crash of waves against the harbor and the faint laughter from Daniel's home, Liang Yue felt a profound sense of closure. The past was behind her, a tapestry of lessons and scars, and ahead lay the uncharted promise of Sunhaven. Knowledge, friendship, independence, and the rare, quiet thrill of freedom she had fought so hard to achieve. The first snow of the year fell lightly over Sunhaven, blanketing the streets in a fragile, quiet whiteness. Liang Yue stood at the train station, her suitcase beside her, watching flakes swirl in the wind. She had intended to travel south immediately, but a delayed train left her stranded, the station nearly empty and eerily quiet. For the first time since leaving her past behind, she felt a flicker of unease. She had grown accustomed to the rhythm of her life at Sunhaven, and being momentarily untethered was almost disorienting. It was then that Daniel appeared, as though conjured by her own need for warmth and guidance. He had come to meet her, smiling warmly despite the chill. "I figured you might be stuck," he said gently, extending a hand. "Why don't you spend New Year's with me and my grandmother? It'll be cozy, and I promise there's no math homework involved." Liang Yue hesitated for only a heartbeat before allowing herself to take his hand. The warmth of his presence was immediate, a comforting contrast to the cold, impersonal station. She allowed herself to lean slightly against him as they walked, feeling the steady rhythm of his steps and the quiet certainty of his companionship. Daniel's home was a small, charming house near the coast, filled with the aroma of simmering stew and the soft laughter of family. His grandmother bustled about, her eyes crinkling in delight as she welcomed Liang Yue. There was no expectation beyond hospitality, no subtle assessment or judgment. For Liang Yue, who had spent years navigating a world of conditional love and expectation, the simplicity of acceptance was almost intoxicating. The evening was warm despite the chill outside. The three of them shared a meal at a small wooden table, passing dishes and exchanging quiet conversation. Liang Yue found herself laughing softly, freely. At Daniel's teasing remarks, at the grandmother's gentle scolding for minor culinary missteps. She realized how starved she had been for such domestic warmth, for a sense of family built not on obligation, but on genuine care. After dinner, they ventured out for a walk along the park near the harbor. The snow had thickened, sparkling in the glow of streetlights and casting a soft, magical blanket over the city. Liang Yue's boots crunched softly against the frozen ground, and she inhaled deeply, savoring the crisp, clean air. For the first time in years, she felt unburdened, untethered from expectation, and fully present in the moment. Daniel walked beside her, his presence steady and comforting. He nudged her playfully as they passed a snow-dusted bench. "Race you to that lamp post?" he challenged, a mischievous glint in his eye. Liang Yue hesitated, then laughed, the sound mingling with the quiet patter of snow. She sprinted, feeling the exhilarating freedom of movement, the thrill of choice, and the warmth of companionship all at once. When they reached the lamp post, they paused, breath visible in the cold air, hearts racing not from exertion but from shared delight. Daniel turned toward her, his expression serious now, the playful mask replaced by quiet sincerity. "You," he said softly. Like you. More than just a friend. I've been wanting to tell you for a while." Liang Yue's chest tightened. She had never been courted with such respect, such honesty, such patience. There was no manipulation, no drama, no expectation. Just Daniel, standing there with sincerity, offering her a choice without pressure. Her lips curved into a small, thoughtful smile. "Daniel, for the first time in a long time, I feel like I can be myself without compromise," she said. Her voice was quiet but steady. "I've learned what it means to choose, to really choose." Daniel's eyes softened, the tension of uncertainty melting away. "Then choose me if you want," he said simply, a quiet invitation wrapped in care and respect. As midnight approached, the fireworks began, bursting over the harbor in vibrant colors that reflected in the icy waters. Liang Yue watched the spectacle, each explosion a vivid reminder of the freedom she had fought to claim. She turned toward Daniel, letting herself meet his gaze fully. With a gentle nod, she allowed herself to embrace the possibility of love. An honest, reciprocal love, not born of obligation or manipulation, but of shared choice and mutual respect. The first snow continued to fall, the world around them transformed into a quiet, sparkling wonderland. Liang Yue's hand brushed against Daniel's, and she allowed herself to linger in the warmth, the certainty, and the joy of the moment. For the first time in decades, she was not merely surviving, she was alive. They walked home slowly, their conversation light, filled with laughter and teasing. Liang Yue realized that she had found more than safety, more than independence. She had found a life worth cherishing, a home built not on expectation but on mutual respect, care, and choice. As they returned to Daniel's warm home, the clock struck midnight. Fireworks continued to bloom in the distance, painting the night sky with color and light. Liang Yue felt a profound sense of closure. The past, with its regrets, its manipulation, its unfulfilled love, was behind her. Ahead lay a life of possibility, freedom, and even love that was truly her own. She leaned against Daniel as the fireworks reflected in his eyes, and for the first time, she allowed herself to hope. Not for approval, not for recognition, not for a life dictated by others. Hope for herself, for her own choices, her own happiness, and the life she had worked so hard to claim. Sunhaven, with its humid air, sparkling streets, and opportunities, had become not just a destination, but a home. And in that moment, Liang Yue understood something she had long forgotten, that happiness could be gentle, earned, and entirely hers to embrace. For the first time in her life, Liang Yue smiled without hesitation. She was free, she was seen, and she was ready for a future that belonged entirely to her. Sunhaven was alive with the golden light of early morning, the coastal air thick with a scent of salt and warmth. Liang Yue walked briskly down the cobblestone streets, her satchel full of books and notes, feeling the rhythm of her life settle into something steady, satisfying, and wholly hers. Every morning was a new chance, every step a quiet assertion of autonomy. She had arrived years earlier as a woman fleeing the suffocating expectations of her past, but she had grown into someone capable of shaping her own destiny. Daniel walked beside her, carrying a small bundle of fresh bread from the market. His smile was effortless, his presence comforting, and for Liang Yue, this had become a grounding force. A life built not on fear, manipulation, or obligation, but on respect, partnership, and quiet companionship. Do you ever miss it? Daniel asked suddenly, breaking the comfortable silence. Your old life, or do you think about it at all? Liang Yue shook her head, a faint smile playing on her lips. Sometimes I remember, but not with longing. Just clarity. The past taught me something, but it doesn't define me anymore. She glanced at him, feeling the warmth of his understanding. I've learned to live for myself, and that's enough. Their peaceful routine, however, was briefly interrupted by one last, desperate attempt from the past. Liam appeared, older, wearied, and clearly shaken by the unexpected turns of his life. He had arrived at Sunhaven, hoping for some reconciliation, some recognition of the life he had imagined he could still reclaim. Liang Yue, he began, voice low and tentative, carrying the weight of years he had failed to navigate. Elena, she lost the baby and now I just please can we? Liang Yue regarded him calmly. She had felt the echoes of this conversation before, seen the patterns repeat themselves, and she had learned to respond with reason and finality rather than fear or longing. Liam, she said firmly, her eyes steady, your life is the consequence of your choices. I am no longer part of it. Elena, and you will have to live with what you have done, and I will live with what I have chosen. That is the boundary. Do not cross it again. Liam's shoulders sagged, a mixture of defeat and disbelief crossing his features. There was no argument he could make, no plea that could break her resolve. Liang Yue's life had become an unassailable domain, a space carved from courage, discipline, and self-respect. He was not her concern anymore. With the past firmly closed, Liang Yue turned her attention to the life she had cultivated in Sunhaven. University lectures continued, each solved equation, each written essay, each research project a testament to the effort she had invested. Her professors recognized her diligence and brilliance, and her peers admired her intellect and quiet authority. Every achievement was hers alone, unmediated by expectation or favoritism. Her relationship with Daniel flourished naturally. They shared not only companionship but partnership, each supporting the other in their respective endeavors. Daniel's sunny disposition complemented her calm determination, and Liang Yue found herself laughing more, resting more, and imagining more. A luxury she had never known in the shadow of the Chun household. Graduation day arrived, sunlight streaming through the grand halls of the university, reflecting in the polished floors and golden accents. Liang Yue stood in her gown, cap slightly askew, feeling the culmination of years of hard work, self-discovery, and resilience. Daniel, beside her, offered a quiet squeeze of her hand, their eyes meeting in a silent acknowledgement of shared accomplishment and mutual pride. Years passed. Liang Yue built a successful career, earning recognition not through connections or manipulation but through merit, intellect, and dedication. Her work allowed her to travel, explore, and create, all while maintaining the steady partnership with Daniel that had become the cornerstone of her happiness. Their wedding was simple, intimate, and joyful. No elaborate ceremonies, no obligations to distant relatives or manipulative figures. Only genuine laughter, shared vows, and the quiet certainty of love chosen freely. Liang Yue felt the profound weight of her journey in that moment, realizing how far she had come from the anxious, obedient young woman who had once signed away her life to expectations not her own. Years later, on a quiet evening, Liang Yue and Daniel stood together, watching the sun dip below the horizon. The sky was painted in brilliant hues of pink, orange, and gold, reflected in the tranquil waters of the harbor. She rested her head against Daniel's shoulder, feeling the warmth of his presence and the steady beat of his heart. "I'm glad you missed that train to the capital all those years ago," Daniel said softly, a gentle tease wrapped in deep sincerity. Liang Yue smiled, a smile unburdened by regret, guilt, or longing. "Me too," she whispered. Her heart was light, her life full, and for the first time, she knew with absolute certainty that she had chosen correctly. She had survived manipulation, neglect, and loss. She had built a life of her own making, nurtured friendships and love based on respect and reciprocity, and created a world where she was seen, valued, and free. The past, with all its mistakes and heartbreaks, was a closed book. The future, brilliant, authentic, and entirely hers, stretched out ahead, luminous and endless. And as the sun disappeared beneath the horizon, Liang Yue felt a profound sense of peace. She had taken the second chance the universe had offered her, and she had lived it fully, courageously, and joyfully. Her life was no longer a shadow. It was hers, and hers alone.